We are here tonight at the launch of the first publication of the Center for Secular Space. Double bind, the Muslim left. Again, who would know?
I'm going to go out and get one.
No, please don't, Meredith. Double bind, the Muslim right, the Anglo-American left, and universal human rights. And of course, I get confused about who's left and right, because that is the subject of the book. We have been on a long journey to get this book written, and some of that will be described by our panelists tonight. But I think it's particularly appropriate that we're here in Toynbee Hall, in the East End, in Tower Hamlets, because this is the area that a few years ago was called in a documentary, The Islamic Republic of Tower Hamlets. And that documentary was unfairly criticized, I think, for being Islamophobic, because it was exposing the control of council politics and much other politics in this area by the Islamic Forum of Europe, one of the many front organizations of the Jamaat-e-Islami. But it's not the whole story. Tower Hamlets has also been an area of secular contestation. This area saw in the 30s the battle for Cable Street, the anti-fascist struggle against British fascists marching in the area. And since then, it's been part of a secular culture which has kept alive here in Britain one of the greatest untold stories of the struggle for accountability for genocide. And that is the story of what happened in '71 in Bangladesh in relation to the War of Liberation and the genocidal campaign carried out by the Pakistani army on the one hand and the Jamaat-e-Islami death squads on the other. That battle is still very much with us today, and we're going to hear some things about it tonight. But the subject of this book is salafi-jihadis. It's a very particular part of the Muslim far right. And that part of the Muslim far right are normally the ones who are deemed to be violent extremists. And some parts of the security establishment say that violent extremists should be the ones who are disapproved of or controlled in various ways, and who have, in fact, been the targets of the renditions campaign. Many of them have been held in Guantanamo and many other sites that are secret sites, and so on and so on. Because of that, we've had them seen largely as torture victims. On the other hand, you have the non-violent extremists, so-called, but as we'll hear, they are not non-violent, who are the Jamaat-e-Islami and the Muslim Brotherhood, whose most visible presence you see in the East London Mosque and the London Muslim Centre, not very far from here. But if you look at the subject of our book, Caged Prisoners, you find that they appear and work very much with the so-called non-violent extremists. And the left has worked with all of them. And in fact, as we move on to doing future work, we'll turn our gaze to the state and show the ways in which the state has worked at various times with various representatives of all these groups. But tonight is, I think we're pleased that we're finally able to be public with the center. We did have a meeting in November last year at SOAS, which is on the web. It was called the Bangladesh Genocide, What the Human Rights Organizations Won't Tell You. And that meeting really set us off in the direction we want to go, in being able to have difficult conversations with people of a range of views. We had the son of somebody who was killed by one of the Jamaat death squads in Bangladesh, talking to Dr. Ghiyasuddin Siddiqui, who is a former Islamist, who talked for the first time about his role in the fatwa, in actually advocating for the fatwa on Rushdie to the government of Iran. We've been struggling with a number of quite complex issues as we began to set up the center. And one of the things that I wanted to do was to acknowledge here, I don't think I can acknowledge everyone because there's so many people who've been involved, but some of the key people who have helped to set the center up. And I particularly want to thank Lucy James and Rashmi Verma and Yasmin Rahman, who stepped forward to form the first board and to set up the center at a time when it was really difficult to even begin to address the idea of secularism as a human rights issue and to be able to publicly criticize human rights organizations. And alongside them, there are many people worked, often by email and so on. There were James and Rajesh and Ben in various parts of the world, Harsh Kapoor from India, to help us establish systems and so on. Many of which are not very great, but as people say in books, the faults are largely down to me sitting here in London, and not to many people who've spent time working on the issues. But I just want to conclude these opening remarks with a story about the question of alliances, which is the subject of this book. And I want us to think back. Some of you may remember that time, some of you will have read about it historically, but to a time during the Second World War, when, as you remember, of course, fascism threatened the whole world, and the Japanese attack, which many people in Europe forget, had already devastated China many years before the Second World War, and had killed thousands and thousands of people, and had caused the mass rape of probably hundreds of thousands of women. And these events were watched very closely in India by Indian nationalists. And at that time, Jawaharlal Nehru, who was simply a political prisoner, was faced with the choice of what kinds of alliances to make. The map of the world was covered pink. It was owned, as it were, the world was owned largely by the British Empire. And what he faced was whether he should make an alliance with Germany and with Japan in order to seize the only chance that he might have had to make India free. And he had the perfect ambassador, informal envoy, of course, at that time, to send abroad to try and make that alliance. His brother-in-law, a man called Ranjit Pandit, had studied in Heidelberg. He knew German fluently. He spoke Italian. He spoke French. He spoke many of the European languages. And he would have been the person who could go and speak to Mussolini and Hitler, who were wooing Indian nationalists. But he didn't make that choice. He didn't send his brother-in-law. His brother-in-law, in the end, ended up in prison as another of the many civil resistors. Nehru ended up incommunicado for many years. The British rejected the offer that the Congress made to make India free and allow India to join the fight against fascism on terms of freedom. Those were very difficult choices. Those were choices made at a time when there was no human rights, as we know it today. There were no settled agreements between governments on the idea of what human rights constitutes. There was no UN. There was no court of appeal. And the Atlantic Charter, which was a foundation for the Western allies to fight against, the allies, I mean, Soviet Union and Britain and both what we now think of the Western allies and the communist bloc to fight against fascism, didn't apply, as Churchill made quite clear, to the subject peoples in the colonies. But yet, there was an ethical imperative that refused that alliance with fascism. Other Indian nationalists didn't make that same choice, and they went to fight, went to Germany and then to fight with Japan and the Japanese forces. So I think the problems that we've seen in the past are problems that we encounter today in conditions that are far easier. And they're easier because however badly they function, we have a system of human rights which is there, both to which we can appeal and to which and within which we can work to change the way that it is often defined. And I think that's really crucial for us to remember, because what happened when Ranjit Pandit and Nehru were incarcerated was that Nehru's sister, Vijay Lakshmi Pandit, who was my grandmother, left jail eventually, was released from jail after her husband died. And Gandhi sent her to San Francisco as somebody to represent in India, free India, against the British delegation and the official Indian delegation that was chosen by the British. And she campaigned with the National Association for Colored People, with representatives of Free India in America, and with many, many other peoples to create a voice. The UN was not a product only of the West or of a stitch-up between the great powers at the end of the war. It was the sign of hope for people who were fighting colonialism and who were fighting oppression of all sorts. And that is something that we often forget. And I think we need to remember that today. It is part of our work as we go forward to talk about secularism and human rights and universal values in ways that they're not usually talked about. So I'm going to now call on Pragna Patel of our panel to explain something about the origins of the book. I don't mean the technical origins, Pragna, but about SBS's role in double bind and its genesis. And Pragna is a very old friend. She's South All Black Sisters. Many of you won't need an introduction to her. But to those who do, she's one of the toughest, bravest, most honorable feminists that I know. And I want to tell a little story about her from way, way back in her life. Because she's really fought from the time she was at school. And when she was at school, her head teacher saw her playing in the playground, and she lived near Heathrow at the time. And most people who went out to work at that time ended up with jobs in Heathrow. And he went past her and he said very approvingly, he said, "You're doing very well at school. If you carry on like this, you'll end up with a desk job at Heathrow." Pragna Patel has made more law before she ever became a lawyer than virtually anyone else I know. And I want to say, because we're often despairing about the state of this country, that she's made the good things about this country, because many of these things that we're going to talk about are going to make us very miserable and make us despair about the state of the left, about the state of human rights, about the state of many things. But everybody on this panel has made the world a better place. Pragna Patel.
I can't live up to that. What an amazing introduction, Geeta. I'm so flattered. I don't think it's true. I've been absolutely inspired by so many people, and you're one of them. It's your politics and those of others in this audience who have shaped my outlook in this world. I'm really delighted to be here at the launch of what I consider to be one of the most important books to come out. I played a very small part in that book, along with Sukhwant Dhaliwal. Sukhwant, where are you? There she is. In fact, I must thank Sukhwant, because she put a lot of immense work into this book initially, or we hadn't thought of it as a book at that time. And following the Amnesty International and the Geeta Sehgal affair, more than anyone else, she spurred us both on as members of Women Against Fundamentalism and as South All Black Sisters. She said, you know, we need to examine in greater depth the facts and the politics behind the public face of Mozambique and cage prisoners. And we felt it was really important to do this because there was an absolute denial in left circles that they were in any shape or form associated with the Muslim right. And indeed, there was such disbelief, shock, and horror at the very public questioning of Mozambique and cage prisoners as human rights defenders. For various reasons, we couldn't complete what we started. But fortunately, Meredith stepped in to complete the project. And I have to say that she's done so with such skill and in such wonderfully accessible language. I think it's quite a feat to convey very complex ideas in very accessible language. And the result is a far superior product than anything I could have imagined. I was asked by Geeta to talk about why Southall Black Sisters supported her critique of Amnesty International and its unwillingness or inability to distance itself from the Muslim right politics as espoused by Mozambique and cage prisoners. Soon after the matter went public, Southall Black Sisters put out a statement in support of Geeta, endorsing her criticism of Amnesty International and of other human rights organizations who are quick to defend, and rightly so, those subject to state torture and terror, but ignore or pay lip service to the victims of non-state terror and torture, especially those committed by or supported by the very people that they seek to defend. And I have to start by saying that the trajectory of our anti-racist, feminist, and anti-fundamentalist politics have led us here. We didn't have to think long and hard, because we've always had to address the double bind, as Meredith puts it, where we often find ourselves facing different and often contradictory directions all at once. And this is, in fact, what defines us and what drives us. And from the moment of our birth, in the heat of intense racism and anti-racist activity, we set ourselves against anti-racist and black feminist orthodoxies, whilst remaining firmly within those traditions. We were compelled to take this position by our daily experiences of working with women from a variety of minority backgrounds who are constantly challenging patriarchal power and control that gives rise to domestic violence, sexual abuse, forced marriage, and other forms of harm in the family and community. But at the same time, also opposing racism, over-policing, criminalization, and demonization of minorities as the other. This has always been a difficult, often lonely, and sometimes dangerous path to tread. But our answer to those who accuse us of betraying the anti-racist and anti-imperialist cause by washing our dirty linen in public has always been to say that silence is collusion. To tackle the double bind, historically, we have had to confront some inconvenient truths about multiculturalism and anti-racism, a politics which often lapses into narrow and essentialist cultural and religious identity politics that deny other divisions and differential access to power within minority communities. We fought against the dominant anti-racist perspectives which all too often reduce the struggle against racial inequality to the sole recognition of cultural and religious differences, a process that actually strengthens identity politics and of which the only beneficiaries have been fundamentalists and authoritarian and conservative religious leaderships. Throughout the late 80s, dominant anti-racist and even black feminist thinking argued for a hands-off approach to protective forms of state intervention in black families. But our frontline experience has led us to a different conclusion. The main problem, we argued, was not that the state was eager to rescue women, but that it was not rescuing women enough from violence and abuse in the family. Our daily work with minority women, such as those who do not have secure immigration status, for example, often illuminate how the boundaries of patriarchal power and state power are often blurred, and how both systems of power constantly interweave, jointly erecting and reinforcing barriers to the realization of the human rights of the women that we work with. That work requires us to create a more dynamic framework to address multiple and complex intersections of power around gender, class, race. It has involved, out of necessity, the constant search for alliances, because we know that identity and alliance building are closely connected. The identity we choose to adopt can limit or increase the potential for alliance building. The demands of the women who attend Southall Black Sisters have compelled us to argue that the response to all forms of oppression is not to retreat into the politics of victimhood, but to seek alliances and solidarity from those involved in similar struggles across different communities. It is this search for alliances that also led us to set up Women Against Fundamentalism. Women Against Fundamentalism was a necessary response to the ever-rising power of transnational politico-religious movements and the growing threat that they pose to women in particular, and to the struggles of all those who seek to develop a genuinely secular and progressive citizens movement based on democratic reform and adherence to core human rights and principles. By publicly supporting Rushdie, we made links between his right to freedom of expression and women's rights to dissent and to take control of their bodies. But in doing so, we encountered considerable hostility from the left. We were told that our stance served to fuel Islamophobia, that you are either with us or against us. At best, we were told, we know that religious fundamentalism is a problem, it's just now is not the time to raise it. And WAF fed directly into other fundamentalist campaigns waged by Southall Black Sisters, especially in South Asian communities. For example, we opposed Sikh religious leaders who attempted to take over local schools in Southall using opting out laws introduced by the Tories in the 1980s. We're also active in the anti-communal organization Awaz in its early days, and its predecessor, Alliance Against Communalism and for Democracy in South Asia. It was formed in the wake of the destruction of the Babri Masjid by Hindutva, that's religious right forces, in 1992. And a key moment in that struggle was the organization of a public meeting in 1993 in the heart of the Gujarati Hindu population in Wembley. We flew over the grandson of Mahatma Gandhi to help us rescue the soul of secularism, which was being eaten up before our very eyes by Hindutva politics in the Indian Hindu diaspora. It was a particularly poignant moment for me, but also one of the most disturbing. Many of the men and women who attended were rabidly Hindu, and their anti-Muslim sentiments and aggression shocked us, as did their denouncement of Mahatma Gandhi as a traitor, who they said had emasculated India by not dealing with the Muslim question. In that forum, however, Southall Black Sisters' alliance with the anti-racist left was severely tested by the refusal of many on the left within that forum to also address the growing problem of the Muslim right in the UK, as well as in the Indian subcontinent. So it was all well to challenge Hindutva, but not the Muslim right. And the problem of the Muslim right was, and I would argue still is, the proverbial elephant in the room. The problem with waiting for the right moment to talk about the religious right, including the Muslim right, is that it never arrives. In the meantime, conservative, authoritarian, and fascist religious right forces continue to consolidate their power, it's becoming more and more difficult to challenge that, especially when religious identity politics are the means by which the war on terror is countered. The secular progressive spaces within our communities, which create the conditions that are conducive to the development of inclusive social justice movements have shrunk to almost zero. And the most marginalized, the most vulnerable, and the powerless have nowhere to hide in the face of rising racism and gender-related violence and patriarchal oppression, which also includes attempts by the Muslim right to force women to accept Sharia law. We should not underestimate the crisis that now exists in our communities, but it is a crisis which, to be frank, only some feminists and a few brave others are willing to face. The problem with waiting for the right moment is that large parts of the left have vacated the terrain of secularism and human rights, apparently on the grounds that it is a Western imposition. This stance has led to many, including women, embracing patriarchal norms and values which oppress women and other minorities. Worse still, this stance has led to the subversion of the very language and concepts of human rights, equality, and discrimination. And the idea of secularism and human rights as alien concepts has permeated UK social policy, and indeed human rights approaches to gender inequality and oppression here and elsewhere. For economic and political reasons, in the UK, at least, the state is only too happy to allow the religious right to control the bodies of women in minority communities in return for the maintenance of the public order. For me, one of the most ironical aspects of Amnesty International's positioning of Mozambique and caged prisoners as human rights defenders is the failure of Amnesty International to see how how Mozambique and others on the Muslim right correctly draw on democratic legal mechanisms such as the rule of law and due process to obtain justice and to demand respect for their human rights, but then deny these very same mechanisms, rights mechanisms, to women and other vulnerable minorities struggling for their freedom from torture, detention, and control in their everyday lives. It's selective use of the human rights framework. Last week, when I read the piece in The Guardian on the leaked memo about the US government's assassination policy on its own citizens, I was reminded of just how terrifying US state power can be. Arbitrary, extremist, and lacking in transparency. The author did a great job in forensically unpicking US double discourse on security and the rule of law. He began his piece with these lines: "The most extremist power any political leader can assert is the power to target his own citizens for execution without any charges or due process, far from any battlefield." I consider this to be as applicable to the religious right as to the US state. Human rights, the rule of law, and due process, matters which the US administration is seeking to undermine, are important, not just because they're the cornerstones of secular democratic principles in general, but because if we cut them down, women and minorities who have the most to lose will have nowhere to hide and will be the first in the firing line, as we're currently witnessing around the world, wherever the religious right has gained power. The main business of the Muslim right, is also to arbitrarily terrorize, torture, and execute its own citizens far from any battlefield. It's in this context that actually we should note also the mass mobilizations of women around sexual violence and gender-related violence in India, Egypt, and elsewhere. I think they're directly linked to the rise of religious fundamentalist movements, and including those who call themselves moderates. I think they create the conditions for the perpetuation of gender-related violence and control. And because of this, we need to ask why it is that the left, at least here, are willing to support women's struggles against gender-related violence, but will not support women's struggles against the religious right. SBS joined in the critique of Amnesty International because in a context where our struggles against the religious right has left us increasingly bereft of our allies, the role of human rights organizations become even more critical as a means of holding the state and non-state actors to account. Women everywhere are invoking their human rights to secure their right to life and liberty, and in the process they're extending and redefining conceptions of rights and justice to make them more progressive and inclusive. But what should we do when human rights organizations themselves lose their moral and ethical compass and seek to dismantle the very concept of the universality of human rights by looking one way and not another? What should we do when the religious right gain electoral power using democratic means and then use their popular mandate to dismantle the universality of human rights, the rule of law, and other mechanisms of democracy? I think these are indeed aspects of the double bind that we have to address, that we must address, if we're to make the concepts of the universality of human rights and secular democracy meaningful. It is a challenge that we at Southall Black Sisters cannot shirk from, however difficult, because we have to stay true to the reality of the daily experiences of the women who rely on us.
Next, we were supposed to have Mariam Namazi come here, but unfortunately she's fallen ill just today, and she sent her regrets. So we have her colleague Fariboz Bouya, who's going to speak in a minute. I remember a demonstration. I've been on many demonstrations now with both you and Mariam, and I can remember one which reminded me of the time when Pragna and I and many other women in this room, Neera and others who are here with us, demonstrated to support Salman Rushdie. And there were about 40 women standing in Parliament Square before pickets were banned from Parliament Square against thousands and thousands and thousands of Muslim men who'd been organized by the Jamaat-e-Islami and other even more extreme groups. And at that time, there were also fascists, white fascists, who were demonstrating against us. And we were accused of standing with them. And I remember recently at a One Law for All demonstration in front of Downing Street, standing with Fariboz and Mariam and many other friends who were here. And on one side of us, we had people who were demanding that Sharia law and God's law be imposed on us. Was it a Muhajiru? Anti-fascists. Yeah. And on the other side, we had the English Defence League. With their agenda. And we were, of course, with neither and against both. And telling the state that they mustn't be soft on the creeping forms of parallel legal systems that are coming into this country. So may I welcome Fariboz, who's going to read Mariam's speech.
Mariam really wanted to be here, and when she phoned me, she said, I cannot not be there, I have to be there, so could you please go and read my speech, because I want to be part of this for tonight's sort of launch. The title of her speech is Politics of Betrayal. Politics of the postmodernist, pro-Islamist left we are speaking of tonight is the politics of betrayal. It's a betrayal of the dissenters and victims of Islamism, but also of the very principles that the left have historically defended. Everything from social justice, egalitarianism, secularism, universalism, and human liberation, including liberation from religion. This pathetic excuse of a left, and I say this coming from the left myself, she says, uses multiculturalism charges of racism and Islamophobia and anti-imperialism, amongst others, to defend the far-right political Islamic movement. Let me begin with multiculturalism. The pro-Islamist left relies on multiculturalism not as a positive lived experience, but as a social policy and political point of view to deny the existence of dissent by pigeonholing individuals and their characteristics into one imagined homogeneous grouping, the Muslim community or the Muslim world. And since it is those in power that determine the dominant culture, this point of view sees Islamic value and Islamist values and sensibilities as that of an authentic Muslim. As Musa Bederi, a professor at Beziad University, the oldest Palestinian university, says, Islamists, I quote, resort to abuse and threat of physical violence, attempting to appropriate for themselves the sole authority of what Muslim can and cannot think, can and cannot do. There are and will remain as many different Muslims as there are unfettered minds, unquote. In fact, those labeled as Muslims include secularists, ex-Muslim, atheists, freethinkers, communists, women's rights activists, socialists, lesbian and gay campaigners, and many others. Even someone like Salman Rushdie speaks for them, for Muslims. As writer Hanif Qureshi says, Rushdie speaks for their doubts. He speaks of the bits of them that they cannot actually feel. Do I really believe in all these stuff, he says? These are the sort of things they cannot say. Conflating Islamism and Muslim is a narrative peddled by Islamists in an attempt to misrepresentation. Contrary to how it is viewed, regressive Islamists are given authority as community leaders, not because they actually represent the Muslim community, but because of the access to the state, political power, and their specific link with political Islamic movement. Multiculturalism is a cheap way for the state to privatize and outsource social control. Clearly, the Muslim community is not synonymous with Islamism any more than English is synonymous with English Defence League or Christians with Christian far-right groups. Ironically, like the far right, which despises multiculturalism, yet benefits from the idea of difference to scapegoat the other and promote its own form of white identity politics, the postmodernist left also uses multiculturalism to side with the oppressor and the Islamists. To accept the Islamist narrative that Muslim equates Islamists is to hand over countless individuals to the political Islamic movement and to ignore the dissent, political and social and civil struggles and class politics. In fact, this politics doesn't merely ignore dissent. In many ways, it forbids it. The likes of a Stop the War Coalition, Socialist Workers' Party, Unite Against Fascism, Islamophobia Watch, Respect Party, or the likes of Ken Livingstone and George Galloway are there as prefects to silence dissenters and defend Islamism as a defense of Muslims. There are many examples to show that they equate Muslims with Islamists. I'll give you an example. In responding to those opposing its alliance with Muslim Association of Britain, which is understood to be a branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, the Stop the War Coalition leadership, Andrew Murray and Lindsay German, have written, anyone remotely acquainted with the British trade union movement will be aware that neither sexism nor homophobia are uncommon in its ranks. Women can be subjected to more crude sexist behavior than they might be likely to encounter within the Muslim Association of Britain. No one would suggest that an anti-war movement we should have no truck with trade unionism until its ranks are 100% cleansed of such behavior. Yet this is good enough as a stick to beat Muslims. Such attitude indicates of a form of racism, a desire to hold the organization at arm's length for the flaws which are, in some measures, tolerable in ours." Unquote. The comparison is absurd. The difference, of course, is that ethos of the trade union is not anti-woman. Its ethos does not say that apostates should be killed, or as the head of the Muslim Association of Britain said recently in a debate with myself, that women should be stoned to death. Its alliance with Muslim Association of Britain is akin to aligning with English Defence League, and then saying that racism exists in the ranks of the trade unions too, so why single out the English? In this type of politics, the oppressor is the victim, and we are labelled as extremists, as Ken Livingstone said when we criticised his support for al-Qaradawi. Moreover, any criticism of Islam or Islamism is deemed to be racist or Islamophobic. As I have explained many times before, criticizing a religion or an ideology or a political movement, far right or otherwise, has nothing to do with racism. In fact, Islamophobia is a term used to scaremonger people into silence. In many ways, these bogus accusations serve Islamism in the same way that Sharia law serves them where they are in power. It helps to threaten, intimidate, and silence criticism and dissent. In my opinion, charges of offence and Islamophobia are equivalent to fatwas designed for the Western audience. It is a warning by the powers that be of what is acceptable and what is not, what is sacred and cannot and must not be challenged. And this goes back to my point of dissent being forbidden. It is, of course, not to ignore that racism exists. Of course it does. But as campaigner Rahila Gupta says, I quote, "Recent anti-racist alliance reveal the capitulation of the left to the fascists within while organizing against fascists without." We should be sophisticated enough by now to construct a politics that is simultaneously anti-racist and anti-fundamentalist so that vulnerable groups like women, lesbians and gays and religious minorities do not hang out to dry. As feminists, we have been abandoned by those who should have been supporting our right to make legitimate criticism. They feel now, during the war on terror, is not the right time. In a racist society, it's never the right time. When we expose the underbelly of our communities, we are told that we are providing ammunition for racists. For us, it is not a choice. We cannot hide one evil to fight another. All truth be told, I do not believe that the concern of this left is racism. Instead, racism is used as a cover to defend Islamism, because this left has an affinity with Islamism, which is itself a force of resistance, and which sees it as a force of resistance and anti-imperialism. And this comes to my point for now, to my final point for now. This left is part of an anti-colonial movement whose perspective coincides with that of a ruling class in the so-called Third World. It is on the side of the colonies, no matter what goes on there. And the understanding of the colonies is Eurocentric, patronizing, and even racist. In a word, according to them, the people in those countries are one and the same. Yep, I'm finishing now. One and the same with the regimes they are struggling against. The left always align itself with the ruling elite of the colonies, irrespective of what this means to people living there and for social justice. It is business as usual for Stop the War coalition to manhandle and throw out anti-Iranian regime activists from the demonstration, and reject resolutions that oppose a war on Iran, but also the regime's attack on the working class and population at large. What's most ironic is Islamism was brought to the center stage by US foreign policy during the Cold War and is still a close ally in helping to manage revolutions and rebellions in the region. What this left forgets, and what we will not stop reminding them of, is that they are supporting a movement that has slaughtered an entire generation in a place like Iran, that just recently assassinated socialist leader Shukri Belaid in Tunisia and shot 15-year-old Malala Yousafzai for wanting education for girls. Islamism is a force that comes onto existence as a right-wing, anti-socialist, anti-left movement supported by the Western powers. It is only after 9/11 that relationship is slightly has changed, and not only to some extent. As long as they agree to terrorize the local population and not the Western cities. As I've said, this is a politics of betrayal.
We now have Ansar Ahmadullah, who, like Pragna, I've known so long, I don't think I can quite remember when I met him, but it's been at least 20 years. He, in his youth, was part of a band called Joy Bangla. And he's looking very embarrassed, but I think we should remember that we've done many things in our lives and do depressing things like, fight fascism of one kind or another. And a lot of his work has been cultural work in this area. It's the recovery of memory, of oral history, a lot of projects around culture, in the sense that we should understand culture, and not as a set of nasty practices that are being defended in the name of culture. But his other work, and that's how one of the ways in which I worked with him, was in the Nirmal Committee, which was a committee of activists set up in Bangladesh. I don't know if it was set up under military rule, but it
was one of the autocratic regime at the time.
It's survived periods of military rule, was part of the democracy movement in Bangladesh, and really, in many ways, led the struggle for accountability for war crimes in Bangladesh. And I worked with Ansar when we made a film. I made a film with my friend David Bergman for 2020 television, and with many activists in Bangladesh who were children martyrs of the struggle, people whose parents had been murdered by death squads, with the Nirmal Committee and many, many others, who were struggling for that accountability. And at that time, it was a very, very hostile government. Now the situation has changed, and I think Ansar will tell us something about it, but I hope also about his struggles here in Britain, in a very lonely struggle to put not only the old crimes of the Jamaat-e-Islami on the record, but also its continuing threat to human rights. Thank you.
Thank you, Geeta. I must apologize for not having read the book yet. So I don't really have a formal presentation for this evening. But I did sort of glimpse through some of the chapters and pick out some of the key themes. The reason that I haven't had much time is because last week has been fairly hectic for some of us Bengali secular activists here in London as well in Bangladesh. Some of you who may follow South Asian stories may be aware of the fact that there has been similar to Tahrir Square movement, there has been a youth uprising in Bangladesh from last Tuesday. Basically, a group of young bloggers, young people, they occupied a street junction in Dhaka, in the capital city of Bangladesh. And I think they're in their 7th day of occupation. And what they've been demanding is the ban on Islamist politics, and also the trial of those Islamists who had alleged to have committed war crimes during the Bangladesh War in 1971. Now, last Friday, some young Bengali bloggers decided to hold a peaceful gathering in a park not far from here called Altawali, close to East London Mosque, in solidarity with the young people in Bangladesh. But by the time they got to the park, the park was basically taken over by local Islamists who had come out of the East London Mosque after Jummah prayer and more or less occupied the whole park. There was a kind of standoff between the secular crowd and the Islamists, I think, for about 6 hours, from 2 in the afternoon till about 8 in the evening. And by the time the sort of demo ended, basically the secular crowd got more or less chased out of the park by the Islamists. Some of the women folks got abused, and I think at least 3 or 4 activists got physically attacked and hospitalized. I am hoping there is a Rebecca Hudson here today. Maybe not, okay. I think she was going to talk about the movement that's going on in Bangladesh, and I think she was going to appeal to you to support the young people in Bangladesh who are fighting Islamism, and as I said, they've been on the streets for last 7 days. Now, coming to the book itself, I mean, I picked out a couple of questions that poses, and the first one is, how does one respond to human rights violations by the Muslim right without feeding into hate campaigns? Now, I guess this is probably a question for the left, for the white left, but I think many don't realize that it's also very difficult for us Muslim activists within the Muslim community to challenge Islamism. And the reason being is that it's very easy for the Islamists to label us as Islamophobic. The moment we start challenging them, it's very easy for them to label us as colluding with the US Jewish lobby and playing into the hands of white racists. I mean, you know, Geeta mentioned her film, War Crimes, that was made in '95. And I remember the Islamists labeled that film as a Hindu-Jewish conspiracy against Islam because Geeta happens to be Hindu and the producer happens to be Jewish. So, you know, it's I think for Muslims it's very difficult in case, and sometimes I think it's almost impossible to counter Islamism from within. And it's maybe because I think there is a very fine line between what the Islamists advocate and the core values of Islam. I'm just trying to think of some examples. Okay, the clothing debate. Islam says that both men and women should dress modestly. Now, this saying is open to interpretation. The Islamist agenda is to, you know, cover up women in either burqa or niqab or jilbab or the hijab. Now, if you were to oppose that clothing, then I think ordinary Muslims would think that you are actually opposing one of the core values of Islam. And that's the difficulty we have within the Muslim community. I think Pragno, somebody talked about the Salman Rushdie affair. Again, with Salman Rushdie, though the campaign against him was led by Islamists, I think most ordinary Muslims took part wholeheartedly in the campaigns, and they felt hurt by, they felt that Salman Rushdie was you know, making a mockery of their beloved Prophet. And as a result, I think Salman Rushdie was condemned by the entire Muslim community, not necessarily by the Islamists alone. So, you know, these are the difficulties that we have to address in our sort of day-to-day business in the UK, in Tower Hamlets. I think there was another question which asks whether human rights defenders should worry about violations perpetrated by those same jihadis or focus on the violations by the state. I would say, I'm trying to put this into context of Tower Hamlets. And as an example, I can give you last year or the year before that, when the EDL threatened to come to Tower Hamlets, or when they did come to Tower Hamlets. There is a very, I don't know how many of you know about Tower Hamlets. There are some of my colleagues were here who could probably respond later on. But there is a very cozy relationship between the Islamists in Tower Hamlets and the local police and the local administration and some of our faith leaders. And the question may arise, why is that? I'm sure the book answers some of the questions, but for us, I think it's fairly easy, because I think for the likes of SWP and Respect, it's quick gains. The Islamists are far more organized than the secular camp, and they can mobilize a large number of people. So it's also a kind of a Muslim vote bank. Not only SWP, even many of our politicians have worked very closely with the Islamists in the hope of getting their support and their vote. And it's probably the same for some of our faith leaders, who would probably hardly get any people in their Sunday service. Suddenly they're getting this huge audience, and in the name of interfaith and multi-faith work. Geeta talked about the case prisoners. Again, locally, this was very much supported by the IFE, which is the sort of Jamaat-e-Islami front group operating in Tower Hamlets and across the UK. I'm going to be very brief, because I think I'll probably be better at responding in the Q&A session, as I didn't really come with any preparation. I just want to end with one final point. There's another question that says about whether the Muslim right is anti-imperialist. Well, our experience with the Jamaat-e-Islami is of course not the case. Again, the Jamaat-e-Islami has been for years supported by the US. And during the war in '71 in Bangladesh, the Jamaat-e-Islami, the Jamaat-e-Islami sided with the Pakistani military junta in abducting and killing Bengali intellectuals. And only recently, I think it may have been last month, during a street agitation in Bangladesh, I think it's one of the Hartals, which is a general strike in Bangladesh. Some of the Jamaat-e-Islami activists attacked and damaged a car belonging to the American embassy. Now, for years, people of Bangladesh have asked or demanded that the Jamaat-e-Islami apologize to the people of Bangladesh for the crimes they have committed. Now, let alone apologize, they've never even acknowledged the crimes that they have committed. Yet, there's this one car that they managed to damage. They made a public apology. They put a press statement in all the papers, and they personally went and saw the American ambassador to apologize for damaging the car. So it kind of shows you the sort of direct connection between America and the Jamaat-e-Islami. And they have also, the American ambassador has asked the Bangladesh government to sit with the Jamaat in a dialogue. So, you can see how they kind of work very closely. I just want to end with one final point as to why the US or the US or the UK or the local administration tend to work with Jamaat-e-Islami. I don't have any academic reference, but from what we know, apparently the US and the UK are, I guess anybody would be, are petrified of bombs going off. Now they think that they need to work with one of the bigger, more organized Islamist groups to contain the smaller extremist groups. Hence the reason why they collude with the Jamaat-e-Islami here, Bangladesh, South Asia, and elsewhere. Now, I do hope that the book addresses those questions as to why the left is so keen to work with Islamists and the threat it poses. Thank you.
Regarding Amnesty International standing on many platforms with Muazzam Beg of cage prisoners and promoting him as a partner and not simply as somebody who'd suffered detention without trial and so on. I knew that it would severely test the ethics of everybody around me. So I knew that what the fallout of it would basically tell us something about the state, not only of the left, but of the human rights movement, of the Quakers and the pacifists and the women's peace movement, and of feminists. And as Pragna has explained, some feminists understood exactly where they stood and immediately took a stand on the issue. But many others were very frightened too. And many others decided that they wouldn't turn their gaze on what a corporation was doing. As Nick Cohen over here said, compared Amnesty to a corrupt corporation, but would decide to turn their gaze instead on the person who'd made the complaint. And for me, this was part of, as it were, a sort of ethical test played out in public, because I understood that things were so difficult and so bad that we wouldn't actually get any answers immediately. And in a sense, this was an experiment to see, what happens, how is it regarded by people, and to be able to unpick what happened afterwards. Now, one of the people who absolutely came through was Meredith Dax, who has a long history of defense work, of human rights defense work and political defense work. She's a wonderful writer. She's written 2 novels called Rivington Street and Union Square, and I really recommend that you read them because they deal with many of these questions as they played out in Jewish communities at the end of the 19th century and early 20th centuries in New York. And she was part of PEN and very senior in PEN, which she left eventually because of their lack of enthusiasm for defending many of the women writers she wanted to defend. And she set up an organization called Women's World, which was only one of many organizations she's founded, because she is, in fact, one of the founding voices and activists of what we now call second wave feminism, of Bread and Roses and many other groups. And Meredith has an excellent bullshit detector. And she was able to get, as Pragna said, to the point, to unpick many very complex debates and to actually show us that they aren't quite as complex as we're making them out to be, that it's actually the political confusion in which so many of us are meandering that is causing that complexity. And so I want now to invite Meredith Dax to come and talk about double bind.
Okay, let me see if I'm tall enough to get to the mic. It's always an issue. Can you hear me? First of all, thank you so much for coming out in this weather. It's so great to see you here, and I want to wish you a good evening and say again, thank you. The subject of this book, I'm going to take it up a level from the local notch, because I can't talk about London politics, but I can talk about transatlantic politics and the left and the women's movement in a more general way. The subject of this book, which you can buy outside, is the Muslim right, the Anglo-American left, and universal human rights, and how we on the left got ourselves tied into knots talking about them. Now, why is this question so important? I actually think it's central to the politics that we have to remake in this period. not only because of the integrity of human rights, but because it is the task of those people who are alive now, I can't say our generation because we span many, to re-envision a left-wing politics that is based on universal human rights, including economic and social rights, as well as the traditional civil and political ones. And re-envisioning the task of the left in those terms began for many of us in the 90s with the Human Rights Conference in Vienna in 1993. And the promise of this conference was that the UN Declaration of Human Rights, which had always had universal rights as its basis, would be made explicit in relation to women and gender. And the declaration that came out of Vienna says, all human rights are universal, indivisible, interdependent, and interrelated. The international community must treat human rights globally in a fair and equal manner on the same footing and with the same emphasis. And then it goes into considerable detail about what this means in terms of women. Now, even at the time, these ideas were bitterly opposed by religious regimes from Iran to the Vatican. They're now being opposed by Russia as well, and they have been opposed by the US whenever the Republicans were in office and tepidly supported the rest of the time. In the 20 years since the Vienna Conference, it has become clear that rather than rethinking their mandate in the light of a fully integrated analysis of gender, many states, many human rights organizations, many international nonprofits have simply added women on the side. You know, like, do you want sugar with your coffee or not? To a program that was otherwise completely the same as it was before. Some have accepted the idea, which is counter to what I just read, that there is a conflict between the rights of women and sexual minorities on the one hand and religious freedom on the other, so that it violates religious freedom. For instance, in the US, if companies that have to buy insurance for their employees have to cover contraception. Some have subordinated the rights of gender and religious freedom to campaigns against state violations during the war on terror. And this war on terror flipped us back even more strongly into the traditional human rights mode of focusing on misdeeds by the state. And certainly there have been misdeeds, many. And the left had its own spin on this by focusing exclusively on the misdeeds of US imperialism and NATO. And while, again, those things must be dealt with, we have to see that in a period of globalization and declining US imperial power, there are also other things going on. And these issues were joined in 2010 when Gita and Amnesty got into the fight that resulted in Amnesty's endorsement of the concept of defensive jihad, which we take up at considerable length here. After Gita resigned, 3 prominent women's human rights defenders in Asia wrote Amnesty a letter, and the letter later became part of a global petition. And they said in this letter, "We believe that Gita Sehgal has raised a fundamental point of principle, which is about the importance of the human rights movement maintaining an objective distance from groups and ideas that are committed to systematic discrimination. This issue of principle is critical at the present moment, with the United States-led war on terror leading to the suspension of human rights and increased surveillance over individuals and the body politic. Ironically, the language of human rights and human rights defenders is being taken over by the US-NATO alliance in its efforts to legitimize a reborn imperialism. Equally disturbingly, this language is also being hijacked by organizations that espouse extremist and violent forms of identity-based politics, as we've been discussing. The space for a position," the letter continued, "the space for a position that challenges both these is shrinking, and human rights are becoming hostage to broader authoritarian political agendas, whether from states or communities. In this context, it is critical for human rights defenders and organizations to clearly define principles and core values that are non-negotiable. In response, defending Amnesty's alliance with cage prisoners, Claudio Cardoni, who was then the interim head of Amnesty, said about Moazzam Begg, now Moazzam Begg and others in his group cage prisoners also hold views which they have clearly stated, for example, on whether one should talk to the Taliban or on the role of jihad in self-defense. Are such views antithetical to human rights? Our answer is no, even if we may disagree with them. Now this is, talk about needing a bullshit detector, you don't need anything. I mean, this is a complete whitewash of the actual Salafi-jihadi doctrine of defensive jihad, which is again discussed here in this book. And this doctrine may use the word defense and conjure up in the Western mind, will you defend your house against marauders? But in fact, it is an aggressive recruiting doctrine meant to mobilize for war. It is a doctrine developed by Abdullah Azzam and put into practice by Osama bin Laden and others, that Muslim men everywhere are obligated, this isn't a question of choice, to take up arms and go wherever Muslims are being attacked and defend them. And this idea is based on framing certain areas of the world in terms of religion as Muslim lands. Thus the conflict in Afghanistan, for instance, which is actually largely pitted Muslims against other Muslims, becomes a conflict only between Muslims and NATO, where all the Muslims are presumed to be on one side, even at the same time that jihadis are blowing up civilians in Kabul. I've seen the same analysis made of Mali, even while jihadis are massacring Sufis in Timbuktu. It's all reduced to questions of American imperialism, and on this basis we get the recruiting pitches which have brought so many young men from the UK to Afghanistan and now to other places. Salafi-jihadi doctrine also includes certain ideas about women, homosexuality, and other religions, most of all other forms of Islam, which are in flagrant denial of universal human rights. The defense of Muslim lands, which many in the left equate to national liberation struggles of the 60s, is not at all like national liberation struggles, which were meant to lead to a prosperous nation of individuals where people in many cases had free choice of all kinds. This defense is meant to lead to a Muslim empire or caliphate in which everyone is supposed to either convert or at best live as extremely second-class citizens, a state in which women will be sequestered and homosexuals put to death. So knowing this, how could a lifelong human rights professional like the head of Amnesty say there was no contradiction between human rights and defensive jihad? How could anyone say that? They could say it because they had made a seamless transition from the national liberation struggles of the 60s and 70s to the current period, which is very different, and assumed that people in the colonies were fighting for freedom then, so anybody who says they're fighting for freedom then is the same. And in this book, we examine, there's a whole section at the end after the bit on cage prisoners, which examines 5 wrong ideas about the Muslim right. And among the ideas this section takes apart is the idea that the Muslim right is anti-imperialist, that defensive jihad is the contemporary equivalent of national liberation struggles, and that the current wars are caused by Islamophobia rather than by complicated political and economic logics. The underlying thesis of the book is that we need a different kind of left, one that is based on solidarity and the universality of human rights, that instead of sanitizing the Muslim right as a way to fight racism in the North, that we have to find ways to ally with Democrats, trade unionists, religious and sexual minorities, and feminists who are struggling in the global South against both neoliberalism and American imperialism on the one hand, and religious fundamentalism on the other. And part of this entails an absolute requirement to stand up for secularism and the separation between religion and the state, because that's the only way that you can have universal human rights. If one religion is empowered to impose its definition of what right and wrong on everyone else, forget it. Now, it's been dogma on much of the left in the last period that imperialism and Muslim fundamentalism are necessarily and inevitably opposed to each other. The actual situation, as has been pointed out, is much more complicated than that. Just look at the relationship between Pakistan and the US. They are allied and opposed. There are factions within each state that pursue opposing policies to each other. And that's why one of the kinds of solidarity we need is a sharing of knowledge and collaborative research between the lefts in Pakistan and the left in the United States and here. And this is true of other countries as well. We need to know what's actually happening in both places so that we don't fall back on vague assertions based on dogma rather than things we actually know based on concrete investigation. Researchers in the US and the UK, for instance, are in a better position to know what policies, what the policy requirements going on in their various states are up to, what the financial issues are, what the competing factions are than are people in Mali. But people in Mali are in a better position to understand the forces active on the ground, the competing groups, the competing security establishments from the West who are in there, the various Islamist factions, who supports them within what government, what the US or UK policy actually means on the ground. Solidarity has to be based on this kind of collaboration and sharing of knowledge. And this is part of the work the Center for Secular Space hopes to develop. Getting back to human rights, the organized left has never had a simple relationship to the ideas of human rights. Despite the history of human rights ideas and discourse in anti-colonial and national liberation struggles, which Gita alluded to, many on the left have framed human rights as a Western plot, thus colluding with and in fact succumbing to the ideas of the religious or nationalist right. But real human liberation cannot come from any embrace of theocracy or of right-wing nationalism either, and that means two things. It means the left has to embrace the ideas of universal human rights as its own ideas, as part of the left. And it also means that we cannot leave human rights up to the people who make it their business, the professionals, the big establishment human rights groups, each of whom has its own organizational agenda. Human rights are too important to us on the left and in the feminist movement for us to leave them to Amnesty and Human Rights Watch. And I'm just going to briefly wind up in an unprepared section by saying, again, this is why secular space is key, because only if we have a space where we can talk about politics in a way that's free of religion can we take these issues on. And those are the struggles now going on in Egypt and Tunisia and in many other places. And we have to be able to say separation between the state and religion is an undergirding, the foundation on which human rights are built, because nobody else will say it if we don't. Certainly the US won't say it, and neither will the oil companies. What the Center for Secular Space is going to do in terms of secularism is we want to develop a popular education program that is global, but that focuses in specific areas of the world and is shaped by local people and local languages and history. We've been asked already to prepare materials by people in Palestine and Lebanon about secularism, that they will be able to shape for themselves, but that we will prepare some basic research. And we're working on a document that's 14 points on what secularism is and is not, that we hope in the coming months to translate into Arabic, Spanish, and French and bring to the World Social Forum. Unfortunately, we don't have any money to do this. And this is going to be a big issue in our work, and I know English people don't like to talk about money. Gita has told me this. But I'm going to end up by talking about it anyway. Because most of the kind of work we do would ordinarily be funded by the foundations that fund Amnesty and Human Rights Watch. Well, guess what? They have very similar politics. They have a commitment to these organizations, and anybody who criticizes these organizations or tries to hold up in a mirror issues of accountability is not going to get funding from these foundations. We have to rely on our friends and people who feel the way that we do. And so far, we're very little, we're very new. We need money for all kinds of things. We don't have a decent computer. Gita doesn't have a decent phone that she can make proper free calls on it internationally. We don't have staff salaries. We need our website redesigned. We need to defray the cost of this meeting and of publications. And in the US, at the end of this meeting, we would just pass the hat. And I actually have a hat here that I gave a friend for the purpose, but Gita said, no, people would be much too embarrassed and it wouldn't work. So we're going to put the hat outside and ask for your support. Gita, you have your hat, that black hat. You have a hat. Okay, well, we'll have a hat. And earnestly ask you to put something in it to at least cover the cost of renting this hall. But we have to, if we want to rebuild the left in a different way, we have to think about that also in terms of financial responsibilities that each of us takes, either in terms of doing work, you know, on a volunteer basis, or in terms of helping if you have a job and can't work. You know, if we're a secularist, you don't tithe to a church. Make us your church. We need that kind of support, and we also need lots of different kinds of volunteer help. So please, talk to Gita, talk to me. If you came in that door, sign up on the list so we know how to contact you. And now I'm going to stop and just, we can all talk.
We have a roving mic up here, so I'm looking for some. Lisa, can I ask you to?
Well, somebody can go to that mic as well.
Yeah, and people can come up to the mic as well up here. So,
say who you are, please.
I'm Irtaza. I have a question about the politics that go on between between Muslims. I know that there is a case where there's a lot of violence between Shias and Deobandi Takfiris, and I think that because we don't really acknowledge them, or we don't really say much about them, you know, then we don't really recognize the violence after. Well, we can, I should say, understand what it will be in the future, but it is important to acknowledge them. And it is, the violence there is quite similar to the identity politics that you talk about. But why is it that intellectuals, even though they do criticize such events, are not heard or appreciated?
I'll take several questions. Anyone else? Anyone else?
Hi, I'm Patrick French. I've got two questions. One is you've spoken, or several of you have spoken quite a bit about the left or about amnesty and about the mistakes that have been made. And I just wondered to what extent as an organization you're actually engaging with the people who fundamentally disagree with you, because the impression I get from the mood of the meeting is that you're speaking to the converted. And to what extent are you bringing the argument towards those who fundamentally disagree with the stand that you've made? And the other question that I had, which kind of came out of the various speeches, was why do you think that the left has got it so wrong on this essential question? I understand how that decision has been made. You've spoken in quite a lot of detail about how those mistakes have been made, what judgment calls have been made which have had, in many ways, quite catastrophic intellectual or political effects. But why do you think so many people jumped the wrong way? Thank you.
Hello, I'm Subir Sinha, and my question is, with so many episodes of effectively controversies regarding intervention in countries like Syria or in North Africa, etc., coming up, does the kind of position you're trying to chalk out require you to think about intervention, especially NATO or some kind of an allied intervention in countries like Syria and so forth?
Do you want to take any more?
Let's go with these. Well, I don't want to address all of them because I can.
I'll address the amnesty.
Okay. Can you see me, or should we stand up again? All right. I mean, I'm not going to address the first question because I don't think I fully understood it. In terms of whether we're talking to the people who we're criticizing, it's not up to us. We try. Gita can tell you how often she tries. It's very difficult to get them to address any of these questions. They would rather get a PR release out. You know, if you're questioning the basic way an organization that is enormously big, powerful, and rich functions, they're going to try to treat you like a fly who gets into the room. And not until you become really, really annoying are they even going to bother to swat you. So so we pose these questions in print, we pose them on the web, we pose them in meetings like this, but we cannot say to Amnesty's senior staff, come and meet with us at a meeting, because they'll just slag you, they won't do it. Why should they? It's not to their advantage to engage with us. It's their advantage to hope they'll wait us out and hope we go away because we can't get any money. And as to why do you think the left gets it so wrong? Well, I think, you know, there are many questions, and I'm not going to even get into what I think of Trotskyism, because that might take us all night. But I think there's a tendency to see things in terms of it's either black or red in this case, or white, you know, in terms of binary, and not to be able to see that you sometimes have to address two problems at the same time. That you can't just say it's all class, or it's all race, or it's all culture, that there's more than one thing going on. And the other thing is, and I can speak to this better in the case of the US, I think there's a sort of racism involved, and deferring to the X community. Well, we'll talk to the leader, you know, it's also enormous arrogance. We're leaders, we'll talk to other leaders. We'll talk to the leaders of the Muslim community. Well, who are they? They're people who say they're leaders. You know, if you ask Pregna who the leaders of the Muslim community are, they're not going to be the same people the left are talking to. So it's partly opportunism, as was said, you know, this is how you get people to your meetings. And it's partly, you know, well, any Bangladeshi will do, let's take the one that's easy to get, and that's racism.
I just want to come back to this question of are you engaging with the people who disagree? I think that's a really important question, and I do ask myself why, despite the fact that this meeting was quite well advertised, I think it could have been advertised earlier. I suspect there are all sorts of good reasons for why it's slightly short notice. But you know, I think we've got a largely, it seems to me, a sympathetic audience. And it's not for want of trying, because I know that I've talked to people here who've tried to get the message to those who disagreed with us when the whole Amnesty International affair kicked off and during that whole period. And when they said, you know, the thing they kept saying was, well, where's your evidence? where's your evidence? We will not accept any of this without the evidence. So now that we have the evidence, perhaps resources permitting, there ought to be a roadshow. There ought to be a roadshow to those communities to try and get people to come, because, you know, they're not here. And I think that's interesting and telling in itself, because here is a public space. I don't think we pretend to have all the answers. These are messy, often complex issues that we're trying to grapple with. But we can only grapple with it if the space is there which has been created where people can come and engage, and they're not doing that. Secondly, that's generally in terms of the left. But secondly, when the whole Amnesty International thing happened, I think she was the director of gender studies, the unit. What's her name? Your boss.
Whitney Brown.
No, the one before her at the UK.
Kate Allen.
Kate Allen.
Amnesty.
Kate Allen came to Southall Black Sisters, and we had a discussion about this. And the fact that she even came to Southall, which is sort of the back of beyond, was in itself telling. She was concerned about feminist response to these issues, and she was concerned about how Southall Black Sisters, amongst others, would view her and would view Amnesty. And we had a frank discussion, and again it boiled down to, where's your evidence? If you have the evidence, we're willing to rethink. So we even suggested that perhaps we should have some kind of a discussion and apply Chatham House rules, so that we could try and engage with those in Amnesty to think again about the kind of issues that have been raised here, sort of even on a general level, forget the nitty-gritty of the Gita Sehgal and Amnesty affair. So I think that, you know, there is a problem with Amnesty itself not wanting to engage with these issues. And I think that's also to do with the fact that they've kind of set their position in stone. And it's very difficult then in public to retreat from that. And yeah, why is the left not, you know, got it wrong on this question? I endorse what Meredith said about, you know, binaries, but I also think there's power politics going on. And I think it gets too messy and too difficult when you're trying to mobilize, if the issues all get confused and complicated. So I think that, you know, the left needs to kind of present a message as clearly as it can, and if other things complicate that, then it becomes difficult for the left. And I think that's about mobilizations and how they mobilize. So, yeah.
I also just want to add one point, and I think reality on the ground is changing. I mean, I've been at this for about 34 years, since 1979. Opposing Islamists both in Iran and abroad, organizing, doing various things. And this is the first time that sort of we have this audience of this kind, and I think the tide is turning. Islamists do not represent the population in the Middle East, that's the key. Islamists do not represent East London, that's the key. And I think the turn is, you know, the tide is turning, well, it has been turning for a while, but now we're at the point to actually represent that turning in the tide. And we see Islamists for what they are. They are a bunch of right-wing fascists. Mm-hmm. That's what they are. And, you know, they need to be, you know, that's, everybody needs to recognize it. And I think one of the most difficult ones is actually put pressure on the governments. I mean, that's the other thing, you know, convincing a lot of other sort of groups, social groups. I think that's one task that we have. The other one is actually convincing the governments that this is a right-wing group and stop them by force, by reality. I mean, that's the other task that we have. And I think, look at Tunisia. Look at the situation in Tunisia. Look at the situation in Pakistan and Bangladesh. And in Iran. The majority of people in Iran oppose the Islamists and the Islamic government. And they're about to overthrow this government. And that in one of these places, actually, the Islamists are properly overthrown. Look at Egypt. The Islamists are overthrown. I think people will start thinking. And I think this meeting and the group of people actually seeing represent that change. And I think that's quite important. Change on the ground and reality.
Answer?
Hello. Okay. Just to address the point of why the left has got it wrong. I mean, I don't have a theoretical answer to it, but I think within the context of Tower Hamlets, what I can say is that I think it's perhaps because of practical reason. I mean, my background is community and youth work, and I have been an anti-racist activist during the 70s and 80s, and I guess by the end of sort of 90s, most of us who were active in the anti-racist struggle became comfortable with jobs within the council, have become councillors, some had sort of settled down, having families, and some have also aged, I guess. And I guess our failure, the failure of the secular camp was to bring in young people to take the leadership of the secular forces. So there was a vacuum, and I think this is where the Islamists came in and took the leadership and have become the kind of spokesperson for the community. And during the struggle, so 70s and 80s, you know, the SWP, the sort of local trade union, teachers union were very much working with us in solidarity in challenging racism. But I think things have changed now because we don't have a very large organized secular camp. I guess the SWP, when they're looking for large number of Muslims, black people, Asian people, they go to the groups that can provide those numbers. And I guess that's the reason why they are working with the Islamist groups. And maybe there's also a wishful thinking on the part of SWP that they may be able to get the Islamists to subscribe to some of the left ideals.
Yeah, let's say that.
Yeah. I think I'm going to stand actually because I'm not sure that people at the back can see very well. I think they're all good questions, and we've all ducked the military intervention one. So I'll say something that is that I believe, and I think some military interventions are very, very successful. And the intervention that I can think of is the Indian intervention in Bangladesh, which supported the Bangladesh Liberation Forces and brought an end to a massive genocidal attack, returned about 10 million refugees back to Bangladesh, of their own will, and restored an elected government. And Bangladeshis were then able to establish their own constitution, not under UN tutelage or anything like that, but through their own democratic processes, set up a secular socialist state. And I think one of the tragedies of Bangladesh is that there has been a period of Islamizing Bangladesh after that, which, unlike Pakistan, didn't completely succeed because it was founded in this struggle. So the secular principles have remained in the constitution, although Islam is now the state religion. And particularly minorities in Bangladesh and other secular people have been fighting to re-establish Bangladesh as a secular state, and that's something that the Awami League unfortunately ducked when they got into power on a secular platform this time. So I actually think that the issue of the left globally, that the pro-Islamist and pro-postmodernist left that Mariam talked about in her speech, I don't think it's just contingent on vote banks and things. I think that's one element. But let's remember that in South Asia, the only fundamentalist government that has been elected to power was the Hindu right in secular India as a leading partner in a coalition government. In Pakistan, they haven't had very many elections, and they don't usually transfer power. They've never transferred power from one democratic government to another. However, whenever Pakistanis have had the right and chance of voting, they have rejected the fundamentalists. Whenever Bangladeshis have had the chance to vote, which they have much more often, they've rejected the fundamentalists. And by and large, Indians have rejected fundamentalist political parties as well. So what is astonishing is the difference between the security analysts in the Western academy and in Western think tanks and so on, who see fundamentalists as the strong men that will re-establish order. But they just think that they have to find the right kind of fundamentalists. And if they find the right sort of fundamentalists, then things will be okay. So they want to separate the extreme from the very extreme and find the moderates among the extremists. They want to work with the non-violent extremists and so on. And for them, the coming to power of the Muslim Brotherhood has been really what a great deal of security policy has been about. If plan A was the dictatorships of the Middle East, plan B has been for a very long time among key figures in MI6 and the special branch and police forces over here, working with the Brotherhood and the Jamaat. And that is the policy based on very colonial principles that they've taken from really their foreign policies and from their colonial policies to actually bring to the streets of Tower Hamlets. So I think there's actually a strategy around this sort of thing. It's not people stumbling around and just picking up some Muslim leader. It's very much putting aside the leaderships that are secular. And I think we do have to point the finger at ourselves as well, as Ansar is saying, as to where we failed to enthuse a younger generation. That failure has not spread to abroad. What we're seeing in India with the anti-rape campaigns, in Bangladesh with this massive campaign around the war crimes issue, are campaigns of mass anger of young people moved by questions of justice who don't talk in human rights terms quite often, and where actually in India the feminists for instance, had to fight a very hard battle against the imposition of the death penalty, against a sort of lynch mob mentality, because of grief and anger and fury at the failure of governments to allow women to walk the streets in safety. But I think this is a change of mood. And Patrick, when you say we need to speak to people, I think you're right. I think we need to speak, I think, to people who are going to be the political activists of the future. Because if human rights people retreat into a jargonistic, legalistic, very technical notion of human rights, they're not going to speak very easily to these social movements, which are also uncomfortable social movements in some ways for us as human rights activists. But we have to engage with that. So that's one set of engagements. The other, as Pragna indicated, was the engagement with Amnesty and Human Rights Watch and so on. Well, one of the engagements we had was by forcing into a public debate organizations to publicly debate with us. And by us, I mean the Center for Secular Space is one of the actors, but we act collaboratively. So about a year ago, we had a long debate with Human Rights Watch in the New York Review of Books. We wrote an open letter to Ken Roth, when in his, who was the head of Human Rights Watch, when in his last year's annual report, he had welcomed the Muslim Brotherhood governments to power. And he had envisaged a scenario which simply wasn't happening. He was urging Western governments not to boycott the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, this was not a Hamas-Palestine scenario. Whatever one thinks of the politics that was played at that time by the European Union or the US state, nobody was boycotting the governments that had been elected in Egypt and Tunisia. And the loans were being negotiated, and the diplomatic relationships were there. So it was bad security analysis, bad strategic analysis on the one hand, and it was bad strategic analysis to create this threat that wasn't there in order to cozy up with them. And I know that Human Rights Watch would have known that they would have had to criticize them at some point, but it was a foolish thing to minimize the threat to human rights that these governments pose, when it's the duty of human rights organizations not to politically welcome anybody to power, but actually to wag fingers at them and tell them what they're not doing on, whether it's police reform or in this case, actually their entire new constitutions, what they were setting in place. Ken Roth, and he involved several of his other people in his debate, explicitly said, in response to us, eventually, when this was published in the New York Review of Books, that there was no support for secularism in human rights. And it's true that there is no support for, there's no, there's no article of any of the declarations or covenants that says that states must be secular. But I think if you read the human rights framework, you can understand by reading both the framework, the articles on freedom of religion or belief, which includes the right to have no belief, and the articles on freedom of expression, that the issue of separating religion from the policy of the state is implicit in it. And I think the struggle for secularism that we're talking about now, and rereading the human rights framework, going back to its classical origins as a radical anti-colonial document, among other things, and looking at, for instance, the last 3 articles of it, which have very seldom been commented on, this is some of the more technical human rights work we want to do, will take us back to some of these issues that are embedded in the human rights framework, and they're similar to what feminists had to do in order to establish that violence against women is prohibited under human rights law. There's not a word of any covenant that says that violence against women is prohibited. So you have to read all the other articles and read these gender issues into them. So the sexual rights issues, the reproductive rights issues, which have been fought for in spite of a massive reaction by fundamentalists, are things that we actually I think the secular debate is similar to that debate. And what's very interesting is if you look at the ways in which many of the large reproductive rights organizations have fought for the issue of reproductive rights and pointed out which articles speak to that issue, they don't mention freedom of religion and freedom of expression. And I think those are 2 key issues where women can decide for themselves, where neither their minds or bodies are controlled. So there's a big silence even among our allies about the elephant in the room, which is religious fundamentalism. And we need to address all those. The amnesty issue is not completely answered, Patrick, in this book, because we're doing further work on that. So this book deals with the left, and that's why we are addressing issues that we need to, as left activists, address. But we also will do policy work on what we call due diligence work on what the human rights organizations are doing or not doing. By publishing in the New York Review of Books, Ken Roth was forced to answer us. The open letter we wrote to him was up on dozens of websites. And, originally 20 women's organizations signed it. After that, many more people signed up to it. Human Rights Watch would not have answered us if the New York Review of Books hadn't published. But by answering us, we have put on record that they failed to distinguish between Islam and Islamism. By going public on the issue of Baig and caged prisoners, we established, and I never expected to establish it. I said that I set an ethical test. I expected many things, but what I never expected Amnesty to do was to sign up to Al-Qaeda's ideology and say that it isn't antithetical to human rights. What Claudio Cordone said was that we have a red line, and the red line is killings of civilians. And because Baig has said sometimes that he doesn't approve of the killing of civilians, that is sufficient for us. Therefore, the rest of defensive jihad, which is precisely about, going back to our first question, which is about Takfiris and Shias, it's about the killings of anybody who disagrees with you. It's about only calling somebody a Muslim who is a salafi-jihadi type of Muslim, which means that you're killing many Muslims as well as atheists and others. And women who want education, and activists, and basically anybody who disagrees with you. So those issues are embedded in defensive jihad. Cordone said, well, for instance, we wouldn't make an ally, and I'm sure you'll be relieved to hear this, of Khalid Mohammed Sheikh. Well, that's nice. But the question that I have to Cordone is, why, what is the distance between, how many degrees of separation is there between Baig and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed? Yes? KSM. So, that's something that this book sets out to answer. And as Pragna said, Kate Allen is asking Southhold Black Sisters, a small women's group situated in West London, whose mandate is to do work that services women facing violence and other issues, and who, of course, do a lot of policy work as well. Are they a security think tank? No, they are not. You know, the head of Amnesty International UK says we don't have any evidence. Now, the fact is, the evidence was there. It was there from sources they didn't want. And one of my purposes also was to say, you know, to get people to understand that if something comes out in a paper that you don't like, the issue is not necessarily the discourse of the paper. Yes, it has a discourse. Yes, you may pay attention to that. But pay attention to some of the facts. And I believe it was Freud who said, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. It's not a discourse. It's not a symbol. It's what it is. Face it. The information we have in this book, the analysis we have in this book, I don't believe has been put out in this form. But many of the facts in this book have been written about, some by Nick, some by other people in this room, and by many, many journalists. And it is actually one of the tactics of the left, so to say there's no evidence. Let's understand this not as bewilderment, but as a denial tactic. Because as soon as the evidence is put on the table, they won't come to a meeting like this. This is advertised, this is, you know, spoken about, but they're not here. And I think we need to understand what's going on at a level of strategy, of governments and of left-wing groups. And I think one of the tragedies is that actually they mirror each other. Because what the left is saying is that there's a primary contradiction. The why is that they say that one of the key arguments is there's a primary contradiction. That contradiction is Western imperialism. Nothing else matters. And what we're saying is actually your tactics are exactly what governments are doing. You know, the Jamaat-e-Islami has been in bed with everybody. They're one of the most promiscuous groups that I have ever come across. And they are thriving on it. And I think we better wake up, because we may be small here in this country, but there are masses of people across the world who have called time on this kind of politics. And I think we need to speak to them. Thank you.
Let me say something. Before anyone else leaves, you should know there's going to be food.
There's food and there's wine, and I was going to say, I think it's time to talk to each other more informally, because there's also people who have long journeys home, and I have no idea what the transport's going to be like. But okay, thank you all for coming.